If you're doing the GAT, then you might be aware that there's an extended writing task that you're required to do in section B. And this is what this video is going to be about, because it's the longest piece of writing that you have to do for this assessment. And just a reminder about what this task is about. For this task, we are given several statements like this, and we have to form our own point of view. And you don't have to use all these statements, you can just use one. However, if you are struggling for things to write about, then what I would do sometimes is to use one of these statements as the backbone for my piece, and then bring in the other statements as either rebuttals or interesting side points. Now, I'm going to go through one of my sample essays for the 2018 GAT, and I'll share some tips and tricks along the way. So let's look at each of these statements and see what ideas we can come up with, and whether we agree or disagree with these statements. So for the first one, the only constant element in life is change. Now, I would probably generally agree with this, since whether it's people, places, knowledge or landscapes, everything is constantly changing throughout our lives. Now, feel free to take the opposite stance or offer some nuances, and you'll see later how I approach a broad statement like this. But let's have a look at the other statements first. So, next one is progress is impossible without change, but change doesn't always result in progress. Basically, this is saying that some change can be good, it can lead to progress, but other changes might be bad and be detrimental. So if you think about some political or social change, yes, some of them are good and lead to progress, while others can have severe consequences as well. And so that's basically for that one. And then for the next one, continuity is better than change. So this is kind of like the opposing view now. So it's saying that we should stay the same rather than change. And this can be true for some things like traditions, if we want to honor a particular person or tradition. So this does have its place, and we can introduce this as a rebuttal if we want. And then last one, too many people accept the way things are rather than try to make things better. So for this, you can talk about social norms or the consequences of what happens when you don't change something that's bad. But on the flip side, you can also talk about if something's not broken, then don't try to fix it. So there's always going to be two sides to each of these statements, so just take whatever you think is going to be the most helpful for you to write this essay. And this has just been a brief overview for these 4 statements. I don't want to spend too long, since I want to mimic how I would approach this task under the real conditions. And for the sample essay that I'm about to show you, I based that essay off this first statement. So the only constant element in life is change. And my contention was this: whether that change be on a global scale or within an individual's life, the only constant element of life is change. But just because change is impossible to prevent, does not mean that it cannot be directed. And so if you're struggling to write a contention, it can be as simple as agreeing or disagreeing with any of these statements. And then after you do that, try to go a step further by saying, yes, I agree on the whole, but there's a small twist. And that's what I did here. So I agree that the only constant element in life is change. However, this doesn't mean that this change cannot be guided. So it's just introducing that extra nuance there. And this is good for a contention because it's more sophisticated and it shows how this statement fits into the larger picture. So basically, to summarize, you don't want to 100% agree or 100% disagree, but at the same time, you don't want to sit at the fence at 50-50. Ideally, you want to agree or disagree about 80%, and then for the other 20%, introduce a bit of a nuance or a catch. Now let's have a look at my sample essay. And the structure for this can be quite flexible, so you don't need to do what I did here as long as you express your idea clearly. But just for simplicity, I opted for the intro and 3 body paragraph structure, as you can see here. And just know that each paragraph doesn't have to be long. You can see that for some of my paragraphs here, they're only a couple of sentences. And just know that a good length is about 1.5 pages to 2 pages. And that's around 350 to 500 words. So hopefully that's doable for the 30-ish minutes that you're given for this task. So starting with the intro, since there's like 80,000 people doing the GAT, it's important to stand out in a good way. And my personal favorite way to stand out was using something called a hook. And a hook is basically something to get your readers or assessors' attention and get them to read on. And this can come in many forms. For example, we might like to begin with a quote or a rhetorical question. But my personal favorite was to begin by describing a scene. So this is what I did. You set your eyes upon the vibrant landscape that confronts your presence, blinding lights, towering buildings, deafening sounds, and crowds rushing to and fro. all of which contribute to the beating heart of our city. But just turning the calendar back a few years ago, the same scene would have been indistinguishable. The heart would have been peacefully laying still. As such is the world we find ourselves in, where change is not only inevitable, but also immense. So you can see that my hook here is describing how change is always present in our lives, and not only is it present, but sometimes change can be enormous. And that is going back to that first statement, which says the only constant element in life is change. And then following this, we have our contention. And this is exactly what I read out before, but ideally you want to have your contention in your introduction somewhere. I personally like to have it at the end of my introduction because that allows you to flow on nicely to your body paragraphs. So basic structure, hook, contention. That's your intro. And another thing that you can experiment with in your introduction is to incorporate a persona. So pretend that you're a certain person or at a certain place. And for one of my sample essays, I pretended that I was giving an online speech on a Zoom conference. So in my intro, I said something like, "Welcome to Victoria's first Zoom conference on the topic of climate change," or whatever topic it was. And so that's just another way to stand out. Feel free to incorporate a persona if you think that suits your writing style. Now, moving on to body paragraphs, the most important thing here is to just make sure your ideas flow on logically. So let's have a look at my paragraph 1. Throughout history, humankind has been driven by its instinctual need to improve what they see in front of them. From the earliest stages of inventing fire to more modern inventions of the light bulb or mobile devices, it is clear such progression is intrinsically tied to change and evolution. This has been a necessary catalyst for everything we take for granted today, since if not for our ancestors seeking improvement, we may still be living in caves and scribbling on rocks for our lifetime. So you can see that the basic structure here is just a clear topic sentence and then some evidence/explanation. So this is like a modified teal structure. And the reason why I don't include a linking sentence is first because there's not too many words to write for this. And second, as long as your paragraph has a sense of conclusion to it for each paragraph, then you don't really need a linking sentence for this case. And just another thing, you can see that I don't include too many traditional persuasive techniques here. And that's because for your writing to be persuasive, you don't need to have those traditional techniques. Yes, they do help, like inclusive language, rhetorical question, but you can also write a really good piece without them as well. And then looking at paragraph number 2, you can see that I introduce another one of those statements. So in this case, as with all change, however, there is always a degree of resistance, so a rebuttal here. Some believe that change will not always lead to progress, and thus choose to accept the way things are. So that's the other statement. It should be acknowledged that reckless change is detrimental to society, which can be seen through humankind's shameful history of imperialism, where colonists sought to rewrite the histories of indigenous residents across the world. These atrocities certainly did not improve humanity and only hindered the progress of reconciliation for centuries. So this was my counter-argument, and you could see that I used historical or current events to back up my points. So try and use as much evidence as possible, so historical or social or political evidence, or even personal evidence. So if you have a story that somehow supports the idea that you're trying to say, feel free to include that because that's always good to have. Okay, so as a brief overview of what we've done so far, in paragraph 1, I said that change was good, it led to evolution. In paragraph 2, I said that change could be bad and it led to some problems like what we have here. And now in paragraph 3, I want to tie these two ends together. So I'm saying although there is an inherent risk in seeking to change what has always been seen as normal, this should not dissuade modern audiences to cease pursuing in what they think is better. So it's going back to that idea that change can be good, it can be bad, but it completely depends how we guide that change that determines how it will affect all of us. So to support this, I say, as glimpses of hope, the 2000 Indigenous bridge walks in Australia or the BLM movement in America has proven that well-intentioned change guides society in recognizing its past mistakes and be able to develop an atmosphere of integrity and respect. As such, the question is not whether we should change or not, but rather, how can we direct change in a positive direction? So that sums up my view on this topic quite nicely. And finally, we have our conclusion. And like the structure for this entire essay, the structure for the conclusion can be quite flexible. So there's no one way of doing it. My personal preference, however, was to first begin by summarizing my contention, as well as what the audience should be doing. Because after people read your piece, it's good for them to know what the next course of action is. So in this case, the answer: since change is inevitable, the only way to progress meaningfully is to reflect on the lessons that history has taught us, that is to enact change with moderation and with the greater good in mind. So that's my summary of my contention and what the audience needs to do. So in this case, it's to enact change with moderation. And then the second part of my contention, so my second sentence, and this is a bit optional, but it does help your essay be a bit more memorable. And what I do here is to bring my essay full circle with my hook. So I'll link this part with the hook that I had at the start. And it reads like this: if this is to be achieved, there is much brighter things that awaits humanity than the blinding lights of the city. If you recall at the start of my intro, I talked about the blinding lights of the city and how that was typical of change. So I'm kind of linking my conclusion back to my introduction. And this offers a sense of conclusion and it brings your essay full circle. So that is always a nice feature to have in your essays. And that's how I would approach this writing task. The full sample essay for this is in the description below, so feel free to copy that into a Word document and look at that at more detail. And just as a final tip, if you want to prepare for this task, you don't have to write lots of essays, and you don't even have to write essays to do well. What I would personally recommend is to go through some of the past papers, look at the prompts, and just write down a contention and what your 3 topic sentences are. And do this for a few papers, since it'll only take you 5 to 10 minutes each time. But overall, it'll make you react much quicker to the actual prompts that you'll get on the assessment day. So that is it. Thank you for watching. And if you want to support me, a somewhat small YouTuber, then I would really appreciate you hitting that subscribe button. And take care.